Everybody. My name is Graham Jacobs. I'm a member of the CHF on the International Advisory Committee, and I'm here to welcome Nicolette Duckham, who is going to be giving our talk for this evening. Now, Nicolette and I go back quite a long way. We first met, I think, when was it? The 1980s, I think, Nicolette.
Ouch,
Yeah.
really? Yes, possibly.
Yeah, well, we were colleagues working in the Cape Town City Council at the time in what was then the Urban Conservation Unit. And I remember one of our big projects at that time was doing that massive inventory of a large part of Cape Town. You remember that, of course.
Yes, absolutely.
Quite a lot of fun with that one. Okay, and then she re-established herself in the UK in London, and she's been working for a number of amenity societies and Historic England. She's been conservation officer, a couple of boroughs, in fact, principal conservation officer in the London Borough of Richmond for many years, and then she's currently lead conservation officer with the London Borough of Croydon. She's also a member of the British Institute of Historic Building Conservation. She sits on the voluntary casework committee of the 20th Century Society. And of course, she's a founder board member of us, our organization, CHF, and a judge for the civic. I've said enough about that. A lot of you may know Nicolette already. So Nicolette, welcome. And we can't wait to hear what you're going to tell us about.
Thank you, Graham.
Solid. Yes.
Thank you for putting me in context. And anyway, I thought it would be nice to talk about cast iron in South Africa because it's a subject close to my heart, and one which I remember with great affection from my early life, which is why I've started with these two slides. Just by way of introduction, really, my love of cast iron in South Africa began, of course, in Cape Town at an early age. My mother spent the first 12 years of my life writing about Victorian architecture, resulting in a substantial reference book on the subject, and I accompanied her on many visit buildings, particularly in the Western Cape, which were rich in cast iron decoration. She also owned an original copy of Volume 2 of the Macfarlane's Castings catalogue, which I have now inherited, and from which some of my slides are taken today. So the talk really is based on my personal lifelong interest and love of cast iron decoration in a colonial context, although I always notice surviving cast iron decoration in Britain as well, and compare it to that which I remember from my South African roots. The first photographs here are significant for me because the one on the right is the cottage I was born in Cape Town and spent my first few years of life there, and with its cast iron veranda, which my parents restored. And on the left is the house that we moved to when I was a bit older, which was a Cape Dutch house, which had been a farmhouse in the area below Table Mountain, and had been updated in the 1850s to be a fashionable Gothic style, with the rather lovely addition of very slender and very tall cast iron columns in a classical design, and that's what you can see in that photograph. I've just got to find my mouse, sorry. So this is the Macfarlane's casting catalogue, from which I've taken some of my illustrations and which I've inherited from my mother. It's the most amazing, wonderful document. And as you can see, it had a supplement as well, which goes with Volume 2. I wish I had Volume 1, but I don't. But anyway, so that really is what was one of my sort of early inspirations in life, being aware of this catalogue. Right, bit of background really to cast iron. This is a Chinese pot and a cast iron manufacturer in China. Cast iron in general gained popularity in the 19th century as it was a cheaper engineering material than wrought iron. Didn't require intensive refining or working with hammers. Its load-bearing strength made it the most important structural metal, and it was used to build some of the first tall buildings. However, it was not a newly invented material, as it had been invented in China in the 5th century BC and poured into molds to make plowshares and pots, as well as weapons and pagodas. Although steel was more desirable, cast iron was cheaper and therefore was more commonly used for implements in ancient China, while wrought iron or steel was used for weapons. Because cast iron is comparatively brittle, it's not suitable for purposes where a sharp edge or flexibility is required. It is strong under compression, but not under tension. The Chinese developed a method of annealing cast iron by keeping hot castings in an oxidizing atmosphere for a week or longer in order to burn off some carbon near the surface in order to keep the surface layer from being too brittle. So it's amazing how far back cast iron actually does go. Apologies, I'm just, there we go. Right, so a bit about the development and early use of cast iron in Britain. This is obviously a map of the British Empire around about the turn of the century, and a statue of Queen Victoria, which you find in so many towns and cities across the empire, as well as in Great Britain. Between 1837 and 1901, Queen Victoria was on the throne and the British Empire was at its height. The fashion for architectural cast ironwork as a building material spread to the farthest corners of the empire at the time, including South Africa as well. This expansion had been made possible by the development of mass production. Joseph Paxton's Crystal Palace, constructed in 1851 for the Great Exhibition under Prince Albert's direction, used mass-produced units of iron and plate glass, which was a revolutionary architectural concept and a triumph of prefabrication. Creating the illusion of a palace made of glittering crystal, hence the name Crystal Palace. The materials were prefabricated in a factory and assembled on site, which made construction of a large building quick and easy. The building housed the first ever international exhibition of its kind, a spectacular display of manufactured products. Before the construction of the Crystal Palace, the use of cast iron for structural purposes had begun in the late 1770s with Abraham Darby III, who built Ironbridge, and there it is on the right. This is a cast iron arch bridge that crosses the River Severn in Shropshire in England. Opened in 1781, it was the first major bridge in the world to be made of cast iron. Its success inspired the widespread use of cast iron as a structural material, and today the bridge is celebrated as a symbol of the Industrial Revolution. In 1815, the Prince Regent, later George IV, commissioned the architect John Nash to transform a modest villa in Brighton into a spectacular Oriental fantasy pavilion through the use of cast iron and ornament. Nash superimposed a cast iron frame onto Holland's earlier construction to support a magnificent vista of minarets, domes, and pinnacles on the exterior, and there you can see it on the left. No expense was spared on the interior as well, with many rooms, galleries, and corridors being carefully decorated with opulent decoration. Even the kitchen incorporated the latest technology and was designed to be seen by guests, with cast iron columns topped with painted copper palm leaves forming part of the structure, thereby giving them both a structural and decorative function. And there on the right, you can see this amazing kitchen, which still exists with its cast iron palm leaves firmly in place. And it was obviously meant to be seen by all his guests so that he could show off suitably as he walked through the kitchens. Crystal Palace. In the 19th century, Britain was dominated by historical revivals such as neoclassicism and the Gothic revival. Apologies, I've skipped in my notes. Right, we are on to the Palm House at Kew, which was built between 1844 and 1848, designed by Richard Turner, an engineer from Dublin, with Decimus Burton as the architect. Constructed of wrought iron and glass, with the roof curved throughout, it has been described as one of the boldest pieces of 19th century functionalism in existence and was the first glasshouse built on this scale, using techniques borrowed from the shipbuilding industry. Engineers proudly exploited the potential of the new materials and built railway stations and market halls with vast iron, wood, and glass spans. On the right, of course, we've got King's Cross, which is in London. It was one of the examples designed by the engineer George Turnbull, an engineer architect Lewis Cubitt, opened in 1852. And it was designed to be simple and functional, with a train shed constructed of wrought and cast iron. It was at the time the largest railway station in Britain. Cape Town also had a railway station along similar lines, and I'll have a photograph of that later on. Right. Architects at the time, unlike engineers, tended to do all they could to disguise basic building materials, employing every possible Gothic or Renaissance detail of decoration and design. The resulting demand for architectural decoration led to the mass production of ornament. Cast iron, plaster or cement ceilings, pressed steel, woodwork, and any number of items, even complete buildings, could be chosen from detailed illustrated catalogues. These materials were also comparatively cheap and easily transported over sea and land to be erected all over the world. In addition to cast iron, in South Africa there was much use of wooden iron for construction, as the materials were comparatively light and could easily be transported to remote locations by horse, ox, and cart. Now we come to Owen Jones, who lived between 1809 and 1874. He published his Grammar of Ornament in 1856, of which this is the cover and a couple of pages. He was a versatile architect and designer and one of the most influential design theorists of the 19th century. In his search for a unique modern style, he looked to the Islamic world for inspiration, came to the attention of Prince Albert, and contributed to the design and colour scheme of the Crystal Palace. 19th century Britain was dominated by historical revivals such as neoclassicism and the Gothic revival, and these design movements were full of religious and social references. As an alternative, Owen Jones strove to develop a modern style with none of the cultural implications. Seeking to identify the common principles behind the best examples of historical ornament, he developed a design language which was suitable for the modern world and one which could be applied equally to wallpapers, textiles, furniture, metalwork, and interiors. And here are a couple of examples from his Grammar of Ornament book. This I should have had slightly earlier. My apologies, I got it the wrong way around. This is a wooden iron building in Kimberley, which indicates how this sort of material was transported all over the country. Very light, easy to transport, easy to construct, still survives today. And also one of the frontispieces of the Macfarlane's catalogue, showing what an amazing array of products they did have on offer. Right. Macfarlane, at the same time as Jones's publication, meeting the demand for both decorative and practical cast iron goods all over the world, and the source of much of the supply were the foundries of Scotland and the Midlands of England. One of the most famous was Walter Macfarlane's Saracen foundry in Glasgow, established in 1850 and operational until 1965. The premises covered 10 acres, and around them grew a new suburb called Postle Park. The company made everything from conservatories, sanitary ware, street lights, fountains, guttering, school desks, and theatre seats. Other foundries specialised in fire grates and kitchen ranges or component parts for bridges, but not Macfarlane. They did this an amazing array of different things. This is a monument to Walter Macfarlane himself. This is his in his cemetery, and this is a rather the only image I've actually seen of him like this. He lived between 1817 and 1885 and spent most of his lifetime as a metal worker, starting with 6 years as an articled gold and silversmith. Devoting the following 14 years to hammered ironwork, he went on to give all his attention to ironwork in all its various branches. His method of casting would have been in general use in all foundries at the time, and is basically the same as that used today. Working drawings were prepared. These were full size, and the pattern makers and wood carvers worked from them. The pattern or mould could be made in several pieces and in combination of timber and iron. With an intricate piece of sculpture, a plaster model was obtained from the sculptor and used to produce a permanent metal mould which could be used again and again and incorporated as a centerpiece in other designs. Macfarlane not only employed their own designers, but also commissioned designs from artists and architects. One was Greek revivalist Alexander Thomson, who lived between 1870 and 1875, who had a large practice in Glasgow. Greek Thomson, as he was called, was a versatile architect, designing such diverse buildings as Presbyterian churches, fashionable villas, terraces, and tenement buildings in the Gorbals. He paid great attention to decorative detail, and his influence is quite clear. Homewood, which this is, was designed by James Cooper, who was a paper magnate, and his wife between 1857 and 1858. In the preface to their beautifully produced catalogues, Macfarlane's, who were contractors by special appointment to Her Majesty's War Department, stated, "We've been largely encouraged by the exceptional position our castings have attained in the markets of the world, and it shall be our endeavour to still further merit the confidence that has been so liberally awarded us." Every casting bore their trademark, which is there on the right, and these castings were registered and marked accordingly to help prevent the pirating of their designs. On the right, you've got a photograph of the Elof Street building in Johannesburg, which they included in their catalogue to give a demonstration of what they could produce. And on the left is the table of contents, which lists the goods obtainable, which range from plumbing necessities to complete buildings, which of course on the right. While the earlier catalogues are illustrated with impeccable steel engravings, the later brochures have coarser drawings interspersed with photographs of buildings that have been erected using their wares. And there we've got one, of course, on the right. Now on to the architect Charles Freeman, who I thought was really important to mention in connection with Macfarlane's castings in South Africa, in particular Cape Town. In Cape Town, South Africa, the pioneering architect Charles Freeman, who lived between 1832 and 1911, who was born in Gloucestershire, had a large practice towards the end of the 19th century. He'd come to Cape Town to join the Department of Public Works. In his spare time, he worked on competition designs for the Houses of Parliament, which these are here. He was the winning entry, which was a turning point in his career, and he went into private practice. And in 1876, and which is when he went into private practice, he was prolific and versatile, designing commercial buildings and churches throughout South Africa. Together with his two sons, John and Charles, he went into the lucrative business of importing building materials, and in particular, the cast ironmongery of Walter Macfarlane. He had his office and warehouse in Strand Street in Cape Town, which is now gone, unfortunately. And besides the Houses of Parliament, three of his key buildings were the Standard Bank in Adderley Street in Cape Town, the Wesleyan Methodist Church on Greenmarket Square, and the Dutch Reformed Church on Church Square in Graaff-Reinet. Now, these are two. This is the Standard Bank on the left. I've used an old photograph because you can actually see the wonderful Macfarlane's cast iron railings around the building, which you can't always see on modern photographs, with the church, with the church on the right. Behind the bank as well, in the old photograph on the left, you can see the old post office with the most amazing cast iron decoration, finials, cresting, all sorts of things. All three of his buildings demonstrate his ability to use mass-produced building materials, decorative cast iron, the latter two, in this case, in a Gothic idiom. Right, just to indicate a few other companies that were also importing into South Africa, not only Macfarlane's, although they were the dominant ones. They weren't the only company to import cast iron into South Africa. In London, the St Pancras Ironworks Company was founded by Henry Bessemer. He was best known for his Bessemer process of steel production, which made steel easier, quicker, and cheaper to manufacture, revolutionizing structural engineering. He set up his powder works at Baxter House, his home in St Pancras, and eventually established the St Pancras Ironworks behind his house, where he developed his steelmaking process. The company specialized in more utilitarian items such as manhole covers, gutters, stair treads, and stable items. Montebello, which this is in Cape Town, is a well-preserved example of their work. And I've also included an image of the stable stall dividers from the Macfarlane catalogue in the bottom right-hand corner, just for comparison, so you can see how similar they were. Right, on to houses. So this is domestic buildings in South Africa, use of cast iron, the evolution of the veranda. In South Africa, as in other parts of the British Empire, geographically more distant from Britain, such as Australia and India, new materials and fashionable trends took longer to reach the country and even longer to reach the more remote parts of the interior. Initially transported by ship from the foundries of Scotland and the Midlands, and then by rail or cart, local architects and builders took their inspiration from more established architects and contractors in towns and cities where new fashions were quicker to arrive. One type of colonial buildings where changing trends were most indicative was the evolution of domestic architecture, and in particular the development of the veranda. One of the biggest contributions made to the South African landscape in every city, town, and village were these verandas. And you can see here, the one on the left is from the Macfarlane's catalogue, clearly Cape Town. And this is quite typical of the sort of building you still find in Cape Town today with these particular castings in place. And on the right are a pair of semis, which also further indicate cast iron still firmly in place, and that's a present-day photograph. So this is already just to give you a bit of background to the evolution of the veranda. During the Dutch colonial era in the 18th century, the stoep, a word taken from the Dutch in South Africa and still used to this day, was generally an uncovered raised terrace in front of a Cape building, which usually ran the length of a facade. You can see the one on the left. These stoops sometimes terminated in ornamental masonry seats at either end. You can see those as well. As time progressed, simple wrought iron railings began to be used on some buildings, and following the occupation by the British in 1806, the Regency influence began to become popular, and canopied decorative verandas replaced open stoops, and you can see that on the right-hand photograph. Supports were either of wood or metal, and a lattice or classical Greek design was often supported on slender columns with curved awning-style canopies. One on the right is the government house or the Tuinhuis, and you can see the verandas on either side of the central part of the building. And here we've got a Georgian example in Harrington Street in Cape Town. Very delicate balcony, no roof, but very, very delicate early cast iron in Cape Town. Otherwise a Georgian building. And here we've got a lattice veranda on the left, an old photograph, rather lovely. You do get a few of those surviving, not many anymore. Which is obviously timber work, very, very fine lattice and spandrels and supports as well. This one has long gone, but I just thought it was such a nice example, it was worth including. Then we've got Donkin Street down the bottom, which is in Port Elizabeth. That's a terrace of houses built in 1860 with cantilevered timber verandas and corrugated iron roofs. You can see the stripes, which became popular. The ones at the top were built slightly later than the ones lower down, but this is quite rare to have them cantilevered in this way. And then on the right, we've got a house called Woodville, now called the Brookshaw Home in Grahamstown in the Eastern Cape. And this was built by Richard Graham Stone in 1849, who owned it for only 11 years before it was bought by George Wood, who was a legislative council member and son of the first mayor of Grahamstown, hence the name Woodville. The ironwork decoration on this building is simple, with slender iron columns, railings, and balusters in a delicate classical style, which form the curved veranda beneath a spectacular dome with scalloped eaves detail. This elegant building, with its fine use of mass-produced decoration, is an example of an earlier use of cast iron before the arrival of McFarlane's. So these are earlier examples before McFarlane sort of dominated the market. Right, so the covered veranda was eminently suited to the South African climate, providing both a place to sit with shade in summer and protection from the heavy rain. Verandas, and in particular cast iron and timber ones, became a feature of many buildings towards the latter part of the 19th century and into the 20th century. They feature in many parts of the British Empire, including South Africa, Australia, and India, with some regional differences in design and materials. It was only during the latter part of the 19th century, when mass production had become possible and prefabricated cast iron components were imported from Britain, that the highly decorative Victorian veranda became highly fashionable. And these are a few examples in Cape Town, just to show the sort of infinite variety and possibilities, from quite a small building in the bottom left to some really elaborate ones, ones on slopes, single houses on corners, wraparound verandas, and rather lovely timber ones on the top left, also with cast iron boundary railings. So the McFarlane's catalogue featured many of these purely architectural items. For the most part, they were also constructional, but their decoration was a matter of fashion. An infinite assortment of designs and sizes of veranda poles, brackets, spandrels, and railings are illustrated in these catalogues. Most are interchangeable, so they could be customized to meet the client's requirements. As you could see in the previous slide, there were so many different variations. Balconies of grand houses, as well as those of small terrace houses, could all be ordered by catalogue, and everyone from bespoke architect-designed houses for private clients down to small-scale terrace house developers used cast iron to decorate the facades of their buildings, in particular showing off the best decoration facing the road. These are just a few examples of what are in the catalogues, you know, the pages and pages of these wonderful spandrels, columns. The bottom right hand photograph shows, you know, the utter simplicity of some of them. used on a small terrace of buildings. This is in District 6, which has since been demolished, more of which later. And here we have a few more. These, of course, are spandrels, brackets, columns, railings, cresting, you name it, you could find it in the Macfarlane's catalogue. Just on to a few extra examples now, just to show the extremes that some of this was taken to in South Africa and other countries like Australia as well. These were what were known as the Oudtshoorn ostrich feather palaces, some of which still survive, including these. Some superb examples are to be found in Oudtshoorn, which is in the Western Cape. The fashion for wearing ostrich feathers lasted from the latter part of the Victorian period until after the First World War. The Karoo, which was dry, was the ideal climate for raising these birds when Oudtshoorn was the centre of the trade. The wealth created by this trade resulted in farmers wanting to display their success by building fashionable houses seen as vulgar and ostentatious by some at the time. Some of these surviving houses have a bounty of cast iron decoration, including verandas, cresting, finials, and railings, which is quite clear to see. Larue House and Gotland House are two such examples. There's another one that was called the Towers, which I haven't got a photograph here of it because it's been demolished. One of the biggest and best was built in 1905 for somebody called Geert Olivier, a wealthy farmer and member of the Legislative Assembly, and it was demolished and replaced by an education building, which was rather sad. The house was adorned with a double-story cast iron veranda produced by Macfarlane's, some of which survives as a relic in a local museum. But anyway, luckily, some of them have survived, and these are two rather lovely examples. Right, so this is a bit about boundary railings and gates, which I thought was probably worth covering as well, just to give you an idea of how these developed over the years. Another significant feature of Victorian buildings in South Africa, where they're proudly displayed cast iron railings and gates. Like verandas, early examples were made of wrought iron or timber, and this is an example of wrought iron, use of wrought iron, there again on Government House, now called Tynhuis. And here we are, some rather lovely images once again from the Macfarlane's catalogue, which you find all over Cape Town and elsewhere in South Africa. As the 19th century progressed, mass-produced cast iron began to be imported in large quantities, and patterns became easily recognizable, particularly when used by developers and builders for more modest domestic buildings, both individual houses and terraces. The more status, the grander the railings and gates, particularly in affluent suburbs. As you can see, some of these are more elaborate than others. Railings for fencing were available from the Macfarlane's catalogues, together with matching gates. These varied in stature according to whether a suburban frontage or several acres of parkland which were to be fenced. And here we have a couple. One of them is in the suburbs of Cape Town on the right, and one on the left is in the country. And you can see equally elaborate use of all this decoration, both in town and country. So anyway, as mentioned earlier, the railings and cast iron didn't only front domestic buildings, but railings, of course, like this, were mainly for domestic use, and they had matching gates, but otherwise they were used for other uses, and including the Standard Bank, which I showed earlier, and the Houses of Parliament in Cape Town, which I also mentioned earlier. And those were two examples of much grander ones being used in a city context. On to finials and cresting. These are, once again, Macfarlane's catalogue crestings, and then the Larue House on the right, just to show you how they were used. Enrichments such as roof finials and cresting are fascinating in their diversity in the Macfarlane's catalogue. Cresting frills consist of a continuous design to be used to fit along the ridge of a roof or round the summit of a turret. At either end or in the centre, finials can be used, and no building was considered complete without these extravaganzas. In a great many sizes, these spiky objects could resemble sprays of flowers, weather vanes, or most elaborate of all, an eagle with outstretched wings. Unfortunately, I was trying to find other examples of cresting and finials on houses that still exist, and it's really difficult to find them. I mean, this is one example, but I think what happens is when roofs are recovered and they're re-roofed, the cresting disappears and so do the finials. Sometimes the finials get knocked off, but they're quite difficult to find nowadays. Right, this is an example I thought was worth bringing up, as it's an outstanding example within an isolated single location, which includes so much variety of cast iron. And this is a place called Muckisfontein in the Karoo. It's an entirely Victorian village planned and built by the endeavours of Jimmy Logan, and there he is in the middle. He arrived in Cape Town in 1877 and managed to get a job at the railway station then being built. He was quickly promoted to become a district superintendent, and he bought a large piece of land and settled with his new wife on the semi-desert Karoo farm he named Tweedside. And there it is in the top left-hand corner. Together they developed the land, planting trees and orchards. He'd intended to build a mansion at Tweedside to complement the 3 grand cast-iron entrance gates. However, this was never realised, and a modest suburban-style Victorian house was built at the end of the avenue of gum trees. Logan began work on Muckisfontein village in 1884, which had started as a small railway siding where he provided meals for hungry rail travellers. The village developed as the business grew, with a main street running parallel to the railway line and a variety of ornately decorative buildings. These included a bank, a post office, a factory, a wooden iron Masonic lodge, and the crowning glory of the Lord Milner Hotel. Here you can see them all, the Masonic Lodge, bottom left, hotel on the top right and in the middle with its cast iron fountain, post office, bottom right. To ensure quality, he imported both materials and labour, and the result was a tour de force of later Victorian taste, with building embellishments of cast iron, timber and plaster decoration with roofing throughout of corrugated iron. Front walls of inset cast iron railings, and the street are lit with lanterns set atop cast iron lamp standards. Innovative features also included waterborne waste disposal and one of the first uses of electric light in his own house. During the Anglo-Boer War, the village became a centre for the British troops, and the hotel was used as a hospital. You can still dig up things that the troops left behind if you walk out into the veldt. Whilst being remote, the village has survived over the last century and a half as a time capsule of a well-planned private enterprise within the Karoo region of Cape Town. Well worth a visit if you're out there. Another thing I thought was worth mentioning were conservatories. Conservatories were once as much a prestige symbol as swimming pools are today, and Macfarlane supplied conservatories and greenhouses, both large and small. They had fish scale roofs, each scale, which contained a pane of glass, was so arranged that the whole roof could be curved. Conservatories tended to be of less use in the South African climate, although a number were built as status symbols attached to larger houses, or in some cases, smaller suburban houses, even in the Karoo. Some were more utilitarian for use by gardeners to propagate plants, more back of house, and some were for public display, and municipal parks and botanic gardens, such as this one, which is the Pearson Conservatory in St. George's Park in Port Elizabeth. Henry Pearson was mayor of Port Elizabeth on 16 occasions, a member of the Legislative Assembly, Treasurer General of the Cape between 1880 and 1881, and Colonial Secretary in 1889. He championed the construction of a conservatory for the cultivation of exotic plants, water lilies, and orchids. It was completed and opened in 1882. And there you can see it in an old photograph on the right. The conservatory was designed and the material supplied by Messrs. J. Boyd and Son of Paisley. So that was another Scottish foundry. Obviously, their products also found their way to South Africa. So it wasn't just Macfarlane's who dominated the market. Right. Now, on to a few more commercial, civic, and institutional buildings, just to give a flavour of the kind of buildings of this sort that you find throughout South Africa. But quite a few of these are in Cape Town. Cast iron verandas and other embellishments were not confined to domestic buildings. Verandas were suitable for providing shelter and shade for public buildings too, particularly in harsh climates. Like domestic buildings, there was an evolution from wrought iron and timber. You can see the old customs house on the left with its rather delicate filigree use of iron, a much earlier building built by the Dutch and then embellished later on in the 19th century. And then on the right, you've got the old Somerset Hospital with its rather lovely, very elaborate timber verandas with their corrugated stripy iron roofs. Now, this one I thought was rather splendid. This is the De Beers Consolidated Mines head office, Stockdale Street, Kimberley, in the Northern Cape. I think they've vacated it now, which is a bit sad, but it was used up until very recently. It's got a double-story painted cast iron veranda running the long length of its main facade and stands out against the backdrop of soft red Kimberley brick, as you can see in the photograph. It was designed in 1887 by the architect White Cooper. The delicate cast iron columns and spandrels interspersed with timber railings, and the balcony columns at first floor level are cantilevered, removing any danger of a column being damaged at street level on a once busy corner. In the midst of Kimberley, it indicated the status of the company it housed. And you can see the cantilevering on the corner here, and the veranda runs around, I think, 3 sides of the building, and is quite spectacular. It really does stand out in the street. What has disappeared are some of the roof embellishments, sadly, though, when it was re-roofed. Right, on to shops and businesses, which vied with one another with the magnificence of their ironclad frontages. Behind the lacework, the buildings could often be austere and simple, but the decoration absolutely, made them sing in any high street, and really where their crowning glory was the cast iron. And you can see in these photographs quite clearly, these are examples in Cape Town, mostly central Cape Town, apart from the black and white in the centre, which was in a suburb called Wynberg, long since gone, sadly, but every embellishment you could possibly think of. And the ones in the colour photographs, which I took in the last couple of years, they still have their cast iron firmly intact. Right, on to roof cresting, and you would proudly display your name on top of your building as well. And from the range of Messrs. McFarlane, you could order your sign as well. You could order the Royal Coat of Arms, or please keep off the grass on a pointed stick, or for setting into the ground, or you could order decorative lettering. Some fantastic, some plain, which could be obtained either in separate letters or incorporated into iron enrichments, suitable for placing above verandas or along skylines. And there we go, the McFarlane's catalogue is at the bottom. And then you've got Lennon's Chemists, it's long since gone, with their amazing ironwork, cresting, lettering, everything you could possibly wish for, displaying their status. And on the right, you've got Haynes Matthew, which actually belonged to my husband's family, which, but also long since gone, sadly. Right, from one extreme to the other, shop fronts didn't have to be elaborate. They could be very simple in much more suburban and country settings. Windows, fanlights, and shop fronts could be more modest and utilitarian, but the same standards of decoration were applied to these simpler versions as to other items in the catalogue. And these are 2 suburban versions where you can see the simplicity, but still with a bit of decoration in the spandrels. This is the old arcade in Market and Commissioner Streets in Joburg, now sadly also demolished. This appears in the McFarlane catalogue as a photograph of one of their products. And this is akin to conservatories, with the most typically Victorian of all cast iron structures, the arcade. Found in cities around Britain, their use in South Africa was perhaps less popular. Whereas most large towns and cities had their quota of arcades, the 19th century version of the shopping centre. Few, if any, still survive in South Africa. Their fish-scale roofs supported on huge brackets, resting on the arcaded first-floor business premises, which led out onto the balconies. These balconies, with their elaborate railings, ran around the arcade above shop level. The ground level had still more ironwork in the form of ventilation and drainage grills. An arcade was, in fact, a microcosm of the founder's art and ingenuity, and a diminutive version of the cathedral-like Victorian railway terminus. And I think that's quite clear in this photograph. Thinking of railway terminus, this is the old Cape Town station, which I think is interesting to compare with ones like King's Cross. Obviously much simpler, smaller, but still the use of cast iron and wrought iron firmly in place. This was demolished in 1964-65. It no longer exists, which is really very sad, because I think it would have been perhaps appreciated far more today. This is not a very good photograph, I'm afraid. I tried to find a good one and I didn't have one of my own to hand, but this is just to show you another tour de force in use of cast iron for a hotel. This is the Blue Lodge Hotel in Long Street in Cape Town, with a double story veranda, many embellishments, and this has survived to this day, now much loved after having fallen into disrepair in previous decades, just to show really a bit of use of cast iron for so many different types of building. This is a church, now the District 6 Museum. It's an old Methodist church in Cape Town, just to show you how even in churches, cast iron was well and truly present, and you could use this sort of detailing both externally and internally. Right, on to something a bit different. These are general items for everyday use. By far the largest sections of the cast iron catalogues are devoted to items of everyday use. Plumbing and drainage feature prominently, and their baths and clawball feet, fluted wash basins, and a wide variety of lavatory pans, complete with overhead systems, pumps, drain covers, gutters, and darn pipes, and they're all a familiar sight. This is just 2 pages from the catalogue, just to give you a flavour of this sort of thing that they had pages and pages of. This is just a drawing I thought I'd include because my photographs of this WC, this loo block in Queen Victoria Street in Cape Town, has now got rather a nasty wall in front of it, which you can see is a sort of red colour in the right-hand photographs. But note the use of cast iron and embellishments, cresting, finials. They pretty much survived on this building. And I think it's a wonderful example of a public loo on the edge of a public garden, where cast iron decoration is now loved again and survived the decades. This is another use which I find interesting. These are more utilitarian buildings, metal framed windows, which were available for more utilitarian and industrial use. This is in the waterfront in Cape Town. These windows, as you can see, are very similar to the ones used or offered by the Macfarlane's catalogue. Sometimes they were made of wrought iron, depending on what age they were, but much, much simpler than the embellishments they offered for so many other purposes. Right, on to the use of lamps and other fountains and drinking fountains. Lamps of every description were offered in ingenious adaptations and combinations of various designs and in various sizes, suitable for gas, electricity, or oil. The pièce de résistance amongst lamps were the street light cum drinking fountains that were once so popular as commemorative gestures. Queen Victoria's golden and diamond jubilees prompted public-spirited citizens to erect Macfarlane's fountains, drinking fountains, bandstands, and clock towers, as well as busts and figures of the Queen displayed upon intricate columns. Now, this one is the Rondebosch fountain in one of the suburbs of Cape Town, and it was donated by the Transvaal mining pioneer, George Pigott Moody. He also pioneered the use of electricity for street lighting, and a cable ran from his home to light the decorative cast iron lantern, the whole structure having been chosen from the Walter Macfarlane catalogue. And there you can see the image from the catalogue on the left. A shield on the Gothic-style column displays the dates 25th of September 1891. Towards the base of the column, chains once held drinking cups above the circular horse trough which stood on hoofed legs. Between the hooves were drinking bowls for dogs, so both man and beast were accommodated within a single structure. The fountain has undergone restoration and redecoration at various times and has also been hit by vehicles, but has survived as a landmark at the intersection of a busy main road. Other similar drinking fountains also survive in the Cape Town suburbs, but besides their practical use, there were plenty installed with a rather more decorative function, either in parks or taking pride of place in front of private residences or more public buildings. Now, these are a few examples here. The one on the left is in front of the place called Vineyard, which is now a hotel. It was a house before that. The one in the middle is another one in the Cape Town Gardens, and on the right is one in another park in the suburb of Wynberg, which used to have more elaborate decoration on it, but over the decades and years they were knocked off. But it still survives more or less intact, but without the added decoration. and just a bit of an archive shot in the middle of me as a child standing in front of the one in the Cape Town Gardens. Right, now this one is a fountain to end all fountains. I think this is what has to be one of the most elaborate, I think, probably in the country. This is the Burgersdorp fountain, drinking fountain, or otherwise known as the Sammy Marks fountain, celebrated Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee and was erected in 1897. It's one of the most elaborate of Macfarlane & Co.'s productions, surmounted by a crown, although this could be substituted in prefabricated style by other finials if desired, and that's the Macfarlane's image on the right. The lacework dome is supported on 8 columns, beneath which is a stalk sitting atop an urn from which water flows into a bowl and drips over the edges into the pond beneath. Salamanders decorate the central column, and more storks and doves look outwards from the ironwork canopy, which are all beautifully picked out in different colours. The type of fountain was similar to others which celebrated the Queen's Diamond Jubilee throughout the empire. And I don't think any talk about cast iron and public parks is complete without a bandstand. This one is in Duval Park in Cape Town. A surviving example of a bandstand, although post Queen Victoria's Jubilee, this one, it was transported to the park, Duval Park, below Table Mountain, and the park was opened in 1895. But it was actually constructed in 1904 and 1905 for the Cape Town exhibition, and it was moved to the park afterwards. And it's got this sort of chinoiserie decoration, which still survives to this day. Another quick one I thought I'd mention was this amazing clock tower in the Cape Town harbour. Decoration aplenty, including these wonderful jewelled glass and porcelain insets, and cast iron porthole windows, which are really quite rare. And this greets you as you come into the harbour, and it still survives today. As you can see, it's beautifully coloured nowadays, so you can't miss it. And bottom right is the Macfarlane's casting image from the catalogue. I just thought I'd say a quick word about local cast iron. So most of the work produced by Macfarlane & Co. and other large foundries was of a high standard, intricate in design, crisp and clear cut. The lesser foundries, and those who started up in the colonies, produced work of a rougher nature, but often of a robustness and vigour well suited to local versions of the mainstream of architectural taste and fashion. Each region and each architect and builder had a particular manner of using mass-produced component parts, and climate, culture and ability were also determining factors. Victorian architecture was a sum total. The tarred and pedimented buildings of officialdom and commerce dominated every main street and square throughout the empire. And one wonders how different a house in perhaps Britain would have been from one in Johannesburg, Sydney or Calcutta. There were several foundries in Cape Town. There was something called the Phoenix Foundry, and it was Hopkins, I think, was another foundry. Most of them didn't survive. I think 1 or 2 might have, but most have long gone. So we've got to the 20th century, and these are 2 Edwardian houses with using a mixture of timber and cast iron. As the 20th century and Edwardian era approached, architectural styles in South Africa began to change once again, following on from similar changes at home. The shift was partly towards a lighter appearance, with verandas once again supported on decorative timber columns and spandrels, and with half-timbered gables in place of cast iron cresting and finials. And you can see that here. This is these are the 1900s for these ones. You can see the cast iron for the boundaries, and the balconies very different to any of the Victorian ones using cast iron. And this is really the influence of the arts and craftsman movement, which also began to be felt in South Africa with the arrival of architects such as Sir Herbert Baker, who eschewed the use of cast iron decoration in favour of a simpler, more natural and more straightforward use of materials. He also introduced a colonial hybrid form of veranda using a covered stoop in classical loggia form with a roof supported on Tuscan columns. This style became popular as part of the design of many suburban houses through to the 1920s and beyond, with new styles still often taking a bit more time to reach remote corners of the country, but remaining for longer as styles moved on elsewhere. And you can see here the veranda style and boundary use of boundary materials, very, very different. On the right, you can see the Tuscan column, but still with a cast iron, at least corrugated iron veranda, so a hybrid style. and the one on the right, left rather, with its bottle-type balustrade, replacing the use of cast iron. This is a bit of Art Nouveau, which found its way. Cast iron, along with decorative wrought iron, did still continue to be used well into the first years of the 20th century, but it tended to become simpler in design, or with an Art Nouveau stylistic influence, although this kind of design is quite rare. However, with the arrival of both wars, use of cast iron impacted heavily, or the wars impacted heavily on the industry, with the loss of customers and skilled labor as foundries shifted towards war work. During the Second World War, much cast iron in Great Britain was removed for the war effort, whereas this was not the case in other colonial countries, such as South Africa. The post-war housing boom provided a temporary respite for the cast iron industry in the manufacture of sanitary ware, and baths in particular, but this too was short-lived as pressure from overseas imports started to have a harmful impact. A handful of firms embraced the shift to using cast iron as a construction medium in building facades. Cast iron did continue to play an important part in building, both structurally and in a decorative manner, until the construction technology of the 20th century took over with steel and reinforced concrete, and with different aesthetic values that were the inevitable following on of an era that could go no further in the application of a profusion of cast iron decoration. Sadly, after the war, the combination of the collapse of the British Empire, the move away from steam power, and the adaptation of new designs and materials meant a vast decline in order for Saracen's foundry and its standard cast iron designs. This is the gateway to the Saracen foundry in Glasgow. The McFarlane Company moved into standard foundry work, including being one of 5 foundries casting Sir Giles Gilbert Scott's classic K6 telephone box for the post office telephones in Britain. After a takeover of the company in 1965, the once mighty works closed, and the buildings on the site were demolished in 1967. And this is the Saracen foundry shortly before it was demolished, firmly shut and looking rather sad. In the 1950s and 60s, the appreciation of decorative cast iron in South Africa fell out of fashion, as did the buildings it adorned. Demolition was the price of progress, and many Victorian commercial buildings were lost to new tower blocks, widened roads, whilst large houses which had stood on substantial sites succumbed to redevelopment and blocks of flats. And I think this is a perfect example of a building in the main street in Cape Town called Cartwright's Corner, and you can see what's there now on the right. Yeah, this is the sort of thing that started happening, sadly. This is District 6, which some people might know about. It was an area in Cape Town that was demolished in the 1960s into the 1970s as part of something called the Group Areas Act, which was a real disgrace at the time. And they entirely cleared this area of Victorian buildings and all its cast iron, leaving what you see in the photograph and not much else. So this seemingly indiscriminate loss of heritage resulted in an increasingly vocal conservation lobby, and eventually in a renewed interest in the recognition and protection of what still survived. As a result, cast iron is appreciated by new generations, with restoration and recognition of its important contribution to the history of colonial architecture in South Africa and beyond. And here we are, my final slide. Luckily, there's still much surviving cast iron all over South Africa, which survived the demolition ball, and most towns and cities, however small, are likely to have some pleasing examples of surviving cast iron. And here you get a high street. This is actually Simon's Town in Cape Town. You can see the mixture of cast iron and column verandas, and then some examples of post boxes, and bollards, and even a telephone kiosk. And there you have it. That's cast iron in South Africa. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nicolette. Yeah, looking at some of these pictures, of course, some of them a lot of these are very familiar to me, of course. But it's also interesting to think when, for example, you showed the example of the horse fountain in Rondebosch, and we see it. I always thought earlier on one of those other pictures, one of the first slide you showed of the McFarlane Foundry, and then on the right there was also another image of a similar fountain. Now it's interesting that in South Africa, elements like that are extremely rare now. I don't think they were that commonplace at the time, particularly ones as elaborate as that. And um, and that one, whereas it might in another part of the world be a fairly standard element, probably in the UK, for example. In South Africa, that particular fountain is a heritage site now. So it's interesting how you'll find that some of these items that were really they were mass produced at the time, can still actually end up by being quite significant. And it really goes once again to their rarity. And yeah, very interesting to notice that. Before, I don't want to ramble on too much. I just want to ask, first of all, are there any questions for Nick? Have any of you who are watching this presentation been to South Africa, maybe? Anyone have any questions, anything they'd like to know or they'd like to ask her? You can say something, you know.
I probably stunned everybody into silence. There's a lot to take in there.
Look, for me, it was very interesting, and of course, as you know, we used to. One thing I also struck me as I was looking at what you were showing here is, and quite rightly, a lot of where you find surviving cast iron is in areas that are not major urban areas. I mean, Cape Town's a bit of a exception there. But for example, in Johannesburg, because of the rapid development of the city, because of the gold mines, there was a massive turnover in buildings very, very soon. So the cast iron buildings that did exist there soon disappeared. Whereas in Cape Town, to a little bit of a less extent, you still, as Nicolette showed you, you find examples in the middle of the city, a few of them, but most of them, like you get more in the suburban areas and then in rural areas. And I guess that applies to most places, but I think in general, maybe a lot of the a lot of the colonies at the time. There's been a lot more rapid development, and so a lot more rapid turnover, should we say, turnover buildings. Whereas, for example, in the UK, I think, for example, the conservation lobby really started long before it did in places like South Africa. And as Nicolette will tell you, her mom, for example, who was a great campaigner for Victorian architecture, was one of the only a handful of people who was actually campaigning for the retention of the style of architecture right into the late 1960s, early 70s. So, Nicolette, yeah, I see we've got a hand up. Oh, we've got a hand up. Okay, Nicholas, question.
Thank you. No, that presentation fascinating, and just wondered from the point of view of somebody who doesn't know about cast iron's properties particularly, but seeing the Iron Bridge and then Crystal Palace and being reminiscent of the Crystal Palace fire, can you say anything about the inherent characteristics of durability of cast iron over time? Because if the Iron Bridge is still there, it looks as if it's extremely durable. And was the fire in Crystal Palace, did that have anything to do with the cast iron, or is that just an irrelevance?
No, that was started, I think in one of the towers. That was started with something like an electrical fault or something. It was something got left on and caught fire, and the whole Crystal Palace basically melted, I think, glass and metal and all. It went up in flames in incredible speed, and basically I think melted. In fact, it's not that far from where I live now, just the site anyway. But I think cast iron, it seems to be that it's quite brittle. So, as I think I said, it under tension it's okay, but it's not very good at bending. which is why I think with things like the Rondebosch fountain, which I think got hit by, Graham probably knows more about this than I do, it got hit by a car a few years ago. I think they've managed to put it back together again, but it's not always that easy with cast iron. But I mean, some of this has endured, for well over 100 years, probably getting on to 150, some of it. As long as it's maintained and it's kept in its sort of, I suppose, in its original position, and it's doing its job, it seems to have lasted extremely well. One of the things about being near the sea, of course, is that this sort of thing can start to rust if it's not looked after very well. But that's something that you obviously have to try and guard against. But otherwise, it seems to have a pretty long life, and it's extremely practical. But unlike wrought iron, it does have different properties. I mean, I'm not really up on the scientific side, but it seems to have been a very good material to use in the colonies, not only for speed of construction, of course, and decoration, but durability as well.
And this was the queue constructed largely of cast iron. I can't remember now.
Sorry, I didn't catch that.
The temperate house at Kew was renovated by the company that also hosts DHF, I think. Was that a cast iron structure, or? Yes,
I was the conservation officer for that, strangely enough, in my other life. Yeah, that's cast iron. That's supposed to be the biggest glass house, I think, in Europe or something of its time. And that's later than the Palm House, which is the one I had in my talk, which is the Decimus Burton one, which is a mixture, I think, of wrought and cast. So yes, the temperate house is cast iron, but it was built in different stages, not all at once.
But that made it very expensive to refurbish, or?
Oh, the cost was huge because cast iron and water basically don't go together very well. And as soon as you've got plants in a quite a wet atmosphere inside a building like that, the building starts to deteriorate very rapidly. And without constant maintenance, which Kew couldn't do at the time, the buildings start to deteriorate quite fast, along with the timber work, because obviously all the windows and things most of the frames are timber, cast iron structure, and the wet gets to them, of course, and then they start to rust, and then the whole thing starts going downhill quite rapidly. So when they came to renovate it, there was a huge amount. I mean, I've never seen so much scaffolding in a building. They must have used most of London's available scaffolding. It was incredible. I mean, they had to completely redo everything. And I think the cost must have been huge, and it had lottery funding to do it. But now it's done, I think they will keep up the maintenance. It's maintenance, if you can keep a cast iron like that in good condition and stop it from rusting, then I think, it lasts and lasts and lasts. But that was an interesting project. I could give a whole separate talk on that one.
Maybe you should, Nicolette.
Oh dear. I mean, I could witter on about cast iron as well and Victorian architecture for hours, but no, it would be very boring.
Maybe I can say make one or two more comments for Nicholas, and that is that cast iron is generally a lot more, it rusts a lot less than steel, for example. It is very much more durable because of its crystalline structure, and it tends to form a layer of oxidation on the surface that prevents further rust. So that's why it's lasted. And of course, if it's painted, it lasts even longer. And if it is, it can be repaired, but as Nicolette told you, it's not only water and cast iron in that sense that they're not exactly friends. But if in a fire, cast iron, when it expands and contracts, it could crack very easily. That's why it's very difficult to weld, for example. And in fact, there are cold fastening systems, literally stitching systems you can get for fixing cast iron. But anyway, that's a whole other technical story. But thanks. Are there any more questions? Otherwise, I think we're already over our time. Anything else? Okay, well, I'd just like to thank Nicolette. Nicolette, thank you very much for joining us and giving what is really a very knowledgeable talk on it. It's interesting for me, of course, even though I see a lot of these things. It's still very interesting for me to just have a look at it and see it all contextualized the way you've done.
That's
Thanks
a pleasure.
very
I think
much.
that's a pleasure. I think because I live in London now and I've sort of lived half my life in both places, I sort of see it from two different perspectives, which I found really interesting actually to revisit.
Yes.
So I hope, yes, that's come across. But anyway.
Oh, yes.
Good.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Pleasure.
Thanks very much, by the way, for setting this all up and making sure that all the buttons on both sides of the Atlantic, Indian Ocean, Atlantic, are working.
Yes, indeed.
Thanks
Thank you very much. It all worked perfectly.
Brilliantly. Thank you.
Thanks then.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.